Okay, thanks for this. This is a Chevron forum. I want to thank my friends at Chevron. We're going to have two panels. We have done a lot of work in my 7 years here at CSIS on multi-sector partnerships. I got my start in international development on multi-sector partnerships. I suspect it's a perennial issue. I think that we are for a whole series of reasons, I suspect multi-sector partnerships are going to be increasingly important. So I wanted to bring some smart people together to help us think about how we should think about multi-sector partnerships in the new world that we're in. And my thought is that that there's a whole series of changes in the developing world. As I say, often this isn't your grandparents' developing world, and it's also not George W. Bush's developing world from 2001 either. And so I think, and it's not Bill Clinton's developing world from 1993. So I think we need to think about how the world has changed and how it's changing. And I think we have to, as institutions like AID or the corporate sector or nonprofit sector or philanthropy, think about how in this changing world what we can be doing. There are a lot of challenges that touch the United States coming from the developing world. There's a lot of opportunities that touch the United States coming from the developing world that directly translate to American jobs and to American security. This is about our direct self-interest. This is not a theoretical discussion. So it's important that we have this conversation. There's no sector, there's no government, whether the U.S. government nor civil society, nor a company, nor philanthropy that can solve any of the global challenges that we face on our own. We have to work together. It's hard, and it means all sorts of contortions. And the best institution that has done the most work on this in international development is USAID. They've been working on this. They sort of institutionalized this and made this a strategic function 15 years ago. This was an idea thought up by the Foreign Service at AID. But really, as you'll hear in this conversation, the AID was working in multi-sector partnerships for a very long time before 2001, 2002. And this has gone across administrations. So I think sooner or later we're going to turn to multi-sector partnerships, whether it's in women's economic empowerment, whether it's in trafficking in persons, or whether it's about combating illegal drugs, whether it's about violent extremism or the push factors of migration. All 5 issues are, if you said to me, what are issues of foreign policy interest to the Trump administration? Those are 5 things of great interest to the Trump administration. So watch this space. But I think there's going to be a whole series of other issues that are going to come up that are also going to be important as well. So, but again, none of the challenges that we face and none of the opportunities we want to seize are necessarily things we can do on our own. So without further ado, I'm going to ask my friend Greg Uger, who's an affiliate here at CSIS, to come up and bring his panel up. And we're going to start with the first panel. Please join me in welcoming my friend Greg Uger.
I'd like to introduce the panel very briefly because we're not long on time. To start with Simon Lowes, who is also an associate, I believe, at CSIS, comes from a long career at Chevron, where he did very important work in partnerships, particularly in Angola and Nigeria, but not only. Lieutenant General retired Charles Cleveland has recently retired as the commanding general for the Army Special Forces Command, and in that context has done a lot of groundbreaking work on opening up the concept of special forces engagement to the non-lethal side, and in that context to open the space for partnerships with business, with the civilian side, government, and NGOs. Lieutenant General Cleveland has a long, illustrious career as a Special Forces general and operator as he came up. I won't go into the details of it for the interest of time, but say that we have a real hero in our midst, and we're very happy that you're here, sir. Morgan Kay, whom I know from our service together in Afghanistan, went to Mongolia, lived with the reindeer people for 10 years, and set up a brilliant NGO to support their way of life in a more modern context. That led her to corporate social responsibility work with Rio Tinto Mining Company, which was kind of the other end of the telescope from what she was doing with the reindeer people, and then went to Afghanistan, worked with me on the transition from from coalition to Afghan authority, and then worked with the State Department and with the Africa Command. Bill Guyton shares with me the experience of being early days in Peace Corps, and then it was called Zaire, later the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Bill then worked with USAID, worked with the U.S. Grains Council, and founded the International Cocoa Institute, which brought together the companies interested in cocoa production and chocolate production to deal with common issues, particularly in places like Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana. Bill is now working with the fine chocolate and cashew industries in the same vein. So this is our panel, and I'm delighted to open with a few comments. Actually, Dan asked me to speak for 10 or 15 minutes. I'd like to kind of set the stage here. I'll build on Dan's paper, A Tale of Two Paths, which I hope most of you have read, and those of you who have not read it would do well to do, because it does a great job of laying out the fact that there are 30 or 40 failed states in the bottom that are not progressing. And there's another large group of states that have emerged from that and are now the prosperous middle. And so the challenge is to help those at the failed bottom to move into the prosperous middle and stay there, not to move back. And I think that within the context of U.S. national security, it's possible to think about those challenges in terms of priorities and focus, and to look at the leverage that has been gotten and can be gotten increasingly from partnerships between government and private sector, between civilian and military, to address those issues. And I would submit that for the government to be fully on board, one needs to take as a point of departure what are the core priorities of the new administration, the U.S. government, with regard to dealing with the challenges of the failed bottom. And where is it that the government wants to put its effort in the broader context of national security, be it areas or be it issues. And regardless of the level of the U.S. foreign assistance budget, it's clear that the U.S. military and the private sector are the locus of the bulk of resources for stabilization and development in fragile states and emerging economies. That didn't used to be the case, as Dan pointed out. It used to be that the big dog in the room were the development budgets. Now that's inverted, and they are not. USAID can be an effective catalyst to help the impact of private sector operations and military operations to better address the societal issues which are the root causes of conflict and stability, and which, if not addressed, will continue to perpetuate the conflict and the instability and the failure and the risks attendant to that. Usaid, in partnership with the U.S. military and the private sector, can support the rapid development of new approaches to governance and livelihoods, and give proof of concept to ones that address the core issues that are the basis of the dysfunctionality of the failed states. So USAID as a catalyst can partner and help quicker give proof of concept to things that the bigger players, the private sector and the military, can do to carry this forward on a sustained basis. To create broad-based term solutions to issues that hold back the fragile states. This supports U.S. national security by sustaining the gains of our military operations and creating the basis for good governance and long-term trade and investment opportunities in markets open to the U.S. companies. The U.S. gets significant leverage on these investments, these partnerships. Financial resources are mobilized far beyond the USAID investments, and I'll give a few examples of that later. And the businesses and institutions created with private partners are self-sustaining and able to grow and adapt over the long term to meet the evolving challenges of the now fragile states as they progress. USAID staff, if encouraged to do so, are in a position to identify and support key local leaders and groups and help them create initiatives and institutions to make the changes they feel are required in their countries. These institutions and businesses are relevant to local conditions and can be self-sustaining for decades to respond to the evolving challenges in their countries. I'll mention 4 examples of USAID private sector and civilian military partnerships with which I'm personally familiar. The first one is from El Salvador, the creation of the Salvadoran Foundation for Economic and Social Development, FUSADES. And there, in the midst of the conflict in the 80s, Salvadoran professionals came together and created an institution that for 34 years has been a respected thought center and spokes institution on democracy and market economy. The key to FUSADES' success is the vision and unwavering commitment of its members. That's the real asset. These leaders know how the world works, know how El Salvador works, and know how to put the two together. From the outset, FUSADES has been committed to the progress and well-being of all Salvadorans. And with strong USAID support in its early years, it launched a number of programs which over the 34 years that they've been operating started with economic, then went to social, then went to institutional, parliamentary, et cetera, and then moved into addressing the issues of the political system, not political parties within their country. One of the special features of that relationship is the long-term thought partnership between the United States and FUSADES and El Salvador and Central America in that context. FUSADES is self-sustaining because it offers value and will be around to help El Salvador deal with its challenges for the long term. Now, another partnership that I'll mention is a somewhat different context, but it's got in common with the FUSADES example, that it's USAID reaching out to local leaders, local players, and helping them create something that's of enduring value and evolves over time in their country. And this is with the Alexandria Business Association, which is created in 1983 on its own, nothing to do with AID, but we became close with them. One day, their leader, Mohammed Raghab, came over to me and said, we'll put up $1 million if you put up $1 million because we think it's important to address the challenges of the less fortunate in Alexandria, because if we don't, we can't keep our businesses and we can't even stay here. And so we want to work with you to create a micro-lending program. We put up our $1 million. We put in our technical knowledge of micro-lending, took them around, we went around the world, visited 5 or 6 really notable micro-lending programs. Bottom line, starting with a $1 million challenge investment made by USAID in 1990, that program has become a model of best practices in micro-lending worldwide, as recognized by the World Bank. And it's made over 1.7 million loans to 663,000 small businesses, not only in Alexandria, but in other places in Egypt. And because of their own linkages with their businesses in their larger business world in Alexandria, and with hundreds of thousands of small businesses, the business association has been able to pull out of the market the obstacles to doing business in Egypt and present those to the government as recommendations for economic reform. Like Fusadas in El Salvador, the Alexandria Businessmen's Association is a long-term respected voice for democracy and market economy in Egypt and is a very good thought partner and friend of the United States. A third that I will mention briefly is one that was created right after the breakup of the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union. We realized at USAID that agriculture could be a good opportunity for creating a new world, a better life for the citizens of those new countries. We thought perhaps to partner with civil society, but we realized that it would be too heavy a lift at that point. We thought perhaps academia, but we realized that academia would be rather slow and not be able to deliver the concrete results that that situation called for in the time that was available. So we realized that the best place to go with our outreach and offer of partnership was to the U.S. agribusiness companies which had already decided or were already working in the former Soviet Union, or who had decided at the board level to make investments in the former Soviet Union, not because of the charity, but because it was good for their core business. They saw all that land in Ukraine and other places in the former Soviet Union and said, that's where we have to be. And so these partnerships developed with about 40 different companies. One of the things that came out of that, I'd like to mention as one of the enduring and growing, adapting examples of the public partner-private partnerships, is the creation of farm service centers. These are locally owned mom-and-pop operations that sold all the inputs and technology needed for farming in their area. Seeds, fertilizer, feed, equipment to rent or buy, and access to credit eventually. This prospered, and it grew because they were private businesses making money. Those that didn't make money didn't prosper and disappeared. But I was there last year and noticed that the 85 farm service centers that had been established in the early years with USAID support, long after USAID left the scene, had come together and created a cooperative private business called AgroStock, which included about 100 farm service centers privately owned, providing the inputs and credit to farmers, to 1.3 million farmers in Moldova. And their total turnover last year was over $25 million. So this program is an example of a public-private partnership that AID supported in a difficult time right after the breakup of the former Soviet Union, which took root and grew and evolved to meet the opportunities and problems in Moldova. And the program has subsequently been expanded to Afghanistan, to Georgia, and Ethiopia. It's being developed now in Ethiopia and many other countries in Africa. The final that I will mention just briefly is the partnership between USAID and the US military right after the operation at the beginning, or right after the invasion of Iraq. So this is May of '03 for the 3 years. And USAID issued a contract to Bechtel to repair infrastructure that was, we thought it was going to be, I was with Bechtel at the time, that was going to be damaged by the war, but really it turned out to be damaged by decades of neglect by Saddam Hussein. Anyway, the partnership piece of this is that USAID needed to partner very closely with the US Army to be able to do the work under that contract in that situation. And so the Army Civil Affairs Group had set up neighborhood, district, and provincial advisory councils all over Iraq. And we were able to go with the military, with security, to those advisory councils and say, as we did in Sadr City, we've been given the job of restoring 200 schools in Sadr City. And we'd like to talk with you about which ones and explain to you the standards of the work for which we've been contracted. So after 3.5 hours of shouting and screaming just so people could vent in rooms that were 120 degrees plus, we would get to yes, we'd be able to explain our mission and get the support of the community so that as our workers went in, they could work safely. And another aspect of the civilian-military collaboration in that context was our need to reach out to hundreds of Iraqi construction contractors to engage them to do the work. And so we were able, with the help of the military, to do that. So the USAID brought Bechtel in. Bechtel had a good capability of doing the reconstruction work. And the military gave us the context in which to reach out to the Iraqi people and then hire contractors and local people to do the work and get it done without everybody getting killed. So as it turned out, that project employed over 40,000 Iraqis and worked with the Iraqi subcontractors did about 70% of the work in a $3 billion project. Now, I'd like to just make a few points with regard to USAID and doing this work and having these partnerships. The first is, as I said, in this world in which we live and what's coming, USAID, I think, can be most effective as a catalyst. You could look at it in a way as a development venture capital organization that brings to the table technical knowledge and some financial resources to prime the pump at the beginning. It can prime the pump with its military and business partners and civil society partners in that context to give proof of concept to ideas that otherwise neither the military nor the business community would implement. And to make those partnerships ones that allow the military or the business community to do what they do, fight and win wars, or set up businesses and employ people and make money, but to do it in ways that address appropriately the underlying root causes of conflict, which are the social, societal issues that wouldn't normally be addressed by military and business operations. And in order to do that, I think USAID needs to put much more emphasis on encouraging entrepreneurial partnering, to have greater outreach. Get out of your office. Life begins on the other side of your door. And to have a greater tolerance of risk. Become less bureaucratic and more nimble. These opportunities don't wait for many months or many years between realization of the recognition of the opportunity and address it. And to create real incentives for its employees to encourage them to seek leverage through partnerships to achieve specific metrics. So I believe that there's enough evidence that we know how to do partnerships, private sector, military, government. But we have to find a shared reason to focus on specific challenges and then mobilize the partnerships around it. So with that said, I would like to introduce Lieutenant General retired Charles Cleveland to make some comments on his experience and views on the subject.
Okay, thank you, Greg. So I have been working when I was getting close to retirement, I was introduced to a Notre Dame business professor, Dr. Viva Bartkus, who was a McKinsey partner, did her thing on the private sector, Oxford, PhD, and she winds up working at Notre Dame as a professor, and she runs a program called Business on the Front Lines, which I get a call from my little brother who's at Notre Dame getting his MBA, and he asked me, hey, can you tell me how are things in Sarajevo? This was about 4 years ago, and I had been in Sarajevo in the mid-'90s when we were interested in that part of the world, and had actually spent 4 tours going in and out of Sarajevo and later Kosovo as well. So I was curious. I said, well, why are you interested? And he explained to me this program that the MBA students at Notre Dame could sign up for a course. MBA volunteers would come back to the school. They would partner with those students. They would then fly to that, in this case, post-conflict area, in this case, Sarajevo, and they would use their skills as MBA students and with the mentors who came from, like my little brother, he went back as a mentor, was working for Intel. So he took time out, went back to the school, took those students, went overseas. In this case, later on, he goes to Senegal. But I was intrigued because as I told him on the phone, I said, that's sort of what we do with our civil affairs troops. So I became interested in what are, in fact, the partnerships that we should be looking at to improve our ability to affect these post-conflict areas. And then that extended into this idea of, well, is there a way for us to actually use this to prevent conflict? Can you identify where there are seeds of instability, and then with the right sorts of inoculating effects coming from either business or education, the whole panoply of things that we play with out there, can we bring them to bear to maybe over time avoid having to go there with troops on the ground or working with the local security apparatus in order to quell an insurgency? Because my career has been about basically insurgencies. Viva sent me a quote when we first started this that I think is appropriate, because in it there are a lot of traps that I think we find when we start talking about partnerships. And it's from St. Augustine. It says, "Let us on both sides lay aside all arrogance. Let us not on either side claim that we have already discovered the truth. Let us seek it together as something which is known to neither of us. For only then may we seek the truth lovingly and tranquilly, if there be no bold presumption that it is already discovered and possessed." Now, if you look inside of that, I mean, wise comments. There are tremendous amount of institutional forces that keep us from, if you will, getting at partnership in the true sense that St. Augustine was talking about. And I think if you get up to the level of government, it's actually supersized, right? And I'll just say, I personally think we are structured to fail. Now, I'm optimistic, there are pockets of excellence that take place because two CEOs get together and they see some corporate responsibility. They use the philanthropy word, even though I guess in some boardrooms they don't like to use that anymore. But they say, okay, we can go do something. But these are isolated pockets. USAID consumed by the places that matter to the United States government, and normally that's in a reactive mode, right? I mean, problems have flared up in Iraq and Afghanistan. We consume a lot of bandwidth trying to work through how do we win, if you will, how do we actually not lose, and there's a difference in those two theaters. So we're structured, I think, poorly. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Post-Cold War, we haven't really adapted yet. I'm not sure that, a government, free government the way we are, is going to be able to be as agile, for instance, as what you saw on the Russian side when they went into Crimea, right? He had no problem using all the levers of government there. we of course have huge problems using all the levers of government to create some kind of coherent response to instability or to a security sector problem out there. Now, it's not to say that we want to mirror them, but we have to recognize that our enemies, whether it's Al-Qaeda or ISIS or Russia or Iran or even China, they are much more adept at adapting and transforming and aggregating capabilities around problems. And then when the problems start becoming mitigated or changing form, disaggregating and bringing together other capabilities as that problem goes away or it moves in their direction. We have huge institutional challenges ahead of us to try to get to that level of adaptability. We don't fund very well. We fund in our silos, and that creates this, as activity happens in our silo, it actually creates a centrifugal force that actually repels other silos. And so while we have, since Kennedy, been looking for this whole of government sorts of solution, and I'm not talking whole of nation solutions, whole of government solutions, the way Congress is built and the way Congress funds is in and of itself an impediment to whole of nation problem solving. And yet we all know that partnering, the idea that no one organization has got the capability to solve these problems, is going to be the key, and I would submit to you increasingly the key in the future. In fact, I would say that and I'm not a professional historian, but I stayed at Holiday Inn Express last night, and so, but no, seriously, I have a hard time finding where in history, where it rhymes with what's going on today. Because if you think about the technologies that are present today, again, all of the global factors, and one of the things I said at the lunch there, I think the dynamic of how much of the national interest do you give up for the global good, that's driving our politics to no small degree. And I think that as you look at the nation and how we secure ourselves, and you look at all of our competitors out there, to include our enemies, right, there is a confluence of the number of enemies, the types of ideologies that we are trying to hold off, and the pervasiveness of this connectivity around the globe that's unprecedented. And we as a species are really kind of grappling with this. And we're grappling with how much of the global thing do we take on at the expense of the national interest. And as it drives our politics, frankly, it makes discussions about partnering, I think, much more interesting. But until we make the case that we have a security sector requirement for the military to get involved in these kinds of things, the military's not interested. We're interested after the fact, right, because we inherited the problem. Okay, I was on the invasion force that went into Iraq. I can remember, after we got some air support, we were pretty successful up in the north. The dog caught the car, right? Baghdad fell. And then it's, okay, what do we do now? And we had some instruments. I had civil affairs that were working for me. My SF detachments were out on the ground. We had our Kurdish partners. We had no Arab connection, and we were in places that had a lot of the Arab tribes were operating in. So, okay, what do we do now? And there was nobody to turn to, so we inherited governance challenges. We had no partners really to look towards. And we really didn't have a good database as to what to do next. I can remember having a staff meeting. We had just liberated Kirkuk and Mosul, and the first time, and we wanted to get power back into the city. We knew that was important. We had to get these people some goods and services, electricity being hugely important, water. I then got an education in, okay, well, you have to have the Baji refinery up so that you could get some oil up towards the to the hydroelectric dam so that you could generate. I'm getting this education. I'm going, okay, where do I get some expertise on how to bring a hydroelectric plant back online and get a pipeline up and running from Baji so that I could bring government? And where was that to be found? Well, it wasn't. And so So it's kind of natural. The military says, hey, I hear all the talk about, they've got these other civilian agencies, they're going to come in and solve these problems. We welcome you to do it. Well, instead, we get accused of militarizing, if you will, development and militarizing policy when we're really just the inheritors of the problem and we've got to solve it. And young captains and sergeants out there do a remarkable job locally taking care of those kinds of things. But we're not structured very well for these kinds of conflicts. Add that to that, we're in this context of a social media world now where that's a downside and it's a huge opportunity in my view. We can know things locally that we've never had the chance to know before, but somebody has to be looking for that knowledge and then have the wherewithal to make things happen as a result of having that knowledge. We can see where seeds of instability are going to start cropping up because we can see it if we're attuned to it, if we have an organization that's attuned to it, and we might even be able to fashion some things to inoculate ourselves from a downstream effect that could cost us millions or even billions of dollars by stemming some of that instability early. That's new, right? Humanity's never been in a place to do that. So I think there's great opportunity, but I think we are structured. We have huge disadvantages. I heard talk about the challenge with corporations working together. We have challenges with inside of government. Certainly, we have challenges working with the corporate world as well. When we did business on the front lines, we tried to get them to come and work with us, but the federal acquisition laws really made it very difficult to work, for instance, with academia. So I'll leave you with the point. I personally think that we've got some fundamental assumptions that need to be taken a look at. We also need, I think the solutions to this are going to come from Congress and academia by studying the problem, by creating a canon for how we do this, some of it based on the good works that all of your organizations have been doing in isolation. And with that, look forward to your questions.
Thank you, General. Morgan, would you like to make some brief comments, please?
Thanks, everybody. So we're here to talk about conflict and fragility on this first panel. That's what we've been asked to discuss, the context of partnership to solve some of the toughest problems in some of the toughest places in the world. The panel that's going to follow us is going to talk to you about some of the more middle income, slightly more stable places. So this is where you're going to hear, I think probably unique to this panel, a little bit about the civil military dimension of partnership. So I'm going to take this opportunity to focus on that. I think we can all agree that conflict, instability are the kinds of problems that affect all sectors in society and therefore take all sectors in society to address. In my experience, much of which in the recent years has been in the world of civilian and military coordination. And when I say that, I mean both within the United States interagency between DoD and organizations like State and Aid, as well as between the military and non-governmental civilian agencies to include the private sector and civil society. The military is often seen as a partner only insofar as they either bring more money or more people. And I want to challenge that notion with a particular example and put forth what I know to probably some folks in this room is heresy when I say that closer partnerships with the military can in fact really be the right pathway forward to advance our development and our human security objectives. I'm going to share an example with you that's going to hit particularly close to home for one person I see sitting in the audience. And it comes from the Lake Chad Basin. So the Lake Chad Basin is an intensely conflict-affected part of the world in West Africa. And in one of the countries, in this multi-country region, there is this incredible initiative that we were recently made aware of and had the opportunity to share some of our thinking on. It was a development finance institution that was funding a road project in one of the most conflict-affected parts of the Lake Chad Basin. The person in the room now knows who I'm talking about. This road project was consequential because the contractor who had been hired by this development finance institution to construct this road over the previous years had almost a dozen of its personnel kidnapped and killed by Boko Haram. As a result, this road project, which promised transformative economic and social opportunity for millions of people in a heavily conflict and underdeveloped part of West Africa, had been halted. The only suitable alternative that could be found, who had both the technical proficiency to construct the road and to operate in a security context that was as intensely threatened as this area, was that country's Army Corps of Engineers. It made that development finance institution very uncomfortable to pass a development contract to a military organization. It made a lot of people very uncomfortable, not least in this particular context, because that particular host country military had very strained relationships with the local communities that were sought to be the beneficiaries of this road project. And as they moved into this area constructing this road, they were in fact creating more instability by the encounters they were having with these community groups. So we had an opportunity, my organization, Motive International, which focuses on bringing unlikely partners together to really capitalize on the different motives and capitals they can bring to bear to mitigate conflict and instability. We immediately thought of two unlikely partners. The first was the US military. The second was civil society, local civil society in this particular region. Here's why. We knew that local civil society in this particular region, largely the partners that had been identified and established by USAID, had incredible ability to be go-betweens and to facilitate positive relationships between that government's security forces and aggrieved populations in that area, and could be incredibly helpful as mediators as this construction crew, which was a military construction crew, rolled by. But we've all, a lot of us have in the field seen when civil society organizations, oftentimes marginalized, oftentimes sort of weak in voice within their own cultural context, try to assert advocacy to a group as powerful as their national army. It can oftentimes be incredibly weak or ineffective, and those security forces tend to just bull right over them and do what they're going to do anyway. That's where the US military came in this particular example. The US military had incredible leverage with this particular host country military, not least because we were both engaged in a counterterrorism fight against Boko Haram, but also because the US military was giving incredible training, advising, assisting to that particular military that they appreciated and wanted. So they had leverage. The real question was, did they have motive? Did the US military care about this development project that promised to bring economic opportunity and infrastructure greatly needed to this incredibly fragile and conflict-affected part of the country? So I reached out to them, and I said, hey, what do you think about this road project? They practically fell out of their seat, and this was at every possible level. This was the teams on ground, and this was up at a very strategic level. They said, that road project we've identified as one of the most transformative projects in this entire region because we think that it will totally change the security dimensions of this region. Here's why. Boko Haram was setting up ambushes in this area that had lack of roads, so people were having to drive into the bush, herders, farmers, to get to market, and were dispersing across a very difficult terrain and were being ambushed by Boko Haram. The U.S. military had assessed that had there been a smooth corridor, an actual sealed road that could be protected and would be a single transit corridor, then you'd have actually increased stability. Perhaps more importantly, they felt that this was an incredible opportunity to change the entire dynamics between that country's government, their security forces, and their people, and actually strengthen the trust that was really the underlying driver of the instability and insurgency and mistrust and lawlessness in the first place. So you had these totally unlikely partners, a development finance institution, a local country's military, Army Corps of Engineers, the US military, who in fact offered to provide aerial surveying data to monitor the progress of the road project, to assist with security as construction went forward, to assert its leverage and influence to ensure that that construction crew was abiding by excellent standards of citizen-centric security and human rights as they went through. Local civil society, largely funded and enabled by USAID, who were in a position to be brokers and sort of monitors and advocates for this. As a result of this project, people estimated that opportunities in agribusiness alone in this region would be opened up to the tune of $10 billion in investment potential of agribusiness. So I'll leave with one sort of what if, and that's if I haven't already started the skeptics in the room maybe thinking slightly differently about the role of military in human security and in economic growth, I'll leave you with this as a potential even follow-on. What if, while the U.S. military was out in these intensely conflict-affected areas of the Lake Chad Basin, where no private sector could operate, where no direct, U.S. NGOs or development organizations could operate, also had with them embedded economic investment scouts looking for those follow-on economic development investment opportunities, really assessing and identifying those social development needs and channeling that information back to the well-established networks of private sector partners, investment community, and classic development partners that we have. So I'll leave you with that thought just to contemplate.
Thank you, Morgan. And now we'll pass to Simon Lowes, who, as said earlier, has significant experience from the corporate sector working in difficult places like Nigeria and Angola.
Thank you, Greg. I learned a new buzzword this afternoon, civ mil, which I think is going to be a big topic here for the next few years about how the civil society and how the military work together and private sector works with the military. I hope I can follow up on quite a few of these comments. I came to this whole area of development about 10 years ago at Chevron, primarily through a lot of conflict issues going on in our operations in West Africa. And I had two interesting experiences. A couple of my colleagues here in the audience will recall all of these, but we were just coming out of the civil war in Angola, and DeSantis had decimated the rebels, and he came to our chairman and asked if we would help rebuild Angola. Prior to that, most of Chevron's work in the whole area of community engagement and social investment was primarily sole-funded projects. We would build infrastructure, we would build hospitals and clinics, and focused a lot on having our operating people in different, and precinct people in different parts of the world actually build community projects along the way. So when we got asked to go ahead and start doing some economic development work in Angola, we flew a team into Luanda and immediately got some input from the government. They wanted us to build hotels and roads and fix up the airport and all that good stuff. Okay.
Morgan, you were great.
All right, good. Anyhow, we very quickly realized that we couldn't do anything of that scale and magnitude, and ran across USAID. They were also going through a lot of changes about how they wanted to engage in Angola. And from that, we formed a very strong and very sustainable long-term partnership with USAID. And what's happening here? Should I keep going? Anyhow, we formed a partnership in Angola, again, because of a request from the government for us to get involved. Simultaneously in Nigeria, our operations were moving into a terrible conflict area. We had $1 billion worth of damage around our facilities, an incredible amount of problems with our pipelines. Our flow stations were being blown up. We had some kidnapping going on. And for different reasons in Nigeria, we started to get heavily involved in partnerships approach to our community development because the government wasn't involved. So we had these two sort of opposing drivers. It was fascinating. Angola was the government asking us to do something. In Nigeria, we were getting involved in having to do something because the local government just gave up, or the national government just gave up on managing the conflict in the Niger Delta. That got us into major partnerships with USAID too, which at the time, look at the next focus, is on strange bedfellows. To us, 10 years ago, USAID was a very strange bedfellow. We were not used to dealing with government agencies. We were used to doing it ourselves. But we really, really quickly learned the power of partnerships. We found tremendous technical expertise in AID that we didn't have. We found a lot of thought processes, value chain type of work, data that we needed to move ahead. On the other hand, we had tremendous organizational expertise in these two countries in these big areas of conflict, but we had no idea how to deal with conflict and post-conflict type of issues. So together, I think we did form some fantastic partnerships, and many of them are still in place. What we learned from those partnerships was we had to do a lot of compromise. We learned a lot about adaptability, flexibility, sharing drivers with each other. Our drivers in those countries were very different than AID's drivers. They were very much pushing democracy type of issues earlier on. Our company was very uncomfortable working on that at the time. But we learned a lot about the power, I think, of talking to each other, and it took us a long time to get those relationships established. And the trust issue, which we talked about a little bit in our sort of meeting this morning, it was tough because neither one of us really trusted each other. We'd never done work with each other. So gradually and slowly, I think as we built trust in each other, we saw each other compromising, we started to realize how important partnerships are towards the impact of your social investment. From that, I think throughout Chevron, both in Kazakhstan, Indonesia, Bangladesh, we've done an awful lot of new development type of programs, all in partnership with people that we would not have done work with, I think, before. I thought what I'd like to do is to actually talk a bit about something I think that is an important part of how we're going to deal with all the budget shifts and all of the changes that are going on, and some of the structural issues that Charles mentioned that clearly are on everybody's minds. One of the areas in the last 2 to 3 years when I was working at Chevron that we kept talking about was, well, what's next after public-private partnerships? There's a lot of conferences, there's a lot of work, there's a lot of academic papers that have been written on the power of public partnerships. And I think every one of us up on the panel here, in our own way, just has really, we'll talk about that much more. And we all recognize from our own different experiences how important partnerships are and how the challenges that you face still today in putting them together. What's intrigued us at Chevron a little bit was why private company partnerships don't spring out of private-public partnerships. Because if you look at all of the different partnerships that AID has, they are a fantastic convening mechanism for companies to get together in relationships under the umbrella of a partnership with AID. But rarely from those partnerships do companies then work with each other separately to even augment and grow the scale and sustainability of work they may be doing under the formation of an AID partnership. So Dan and his team at CSIS, just about a year or so, started to, I think about the same topic. And we did some research. One of the ladies in the audience, Helen here, did some fantastic research here on that issue as to what may be stopping companies from actually talking to each other. And I thought really quickly I could give you a couple of the findings from that research. One of the first items that came up in most of the interviews we had was there isn't a good convening mechanism for companies to talk to each other. And again, I think this is germane to the partnership, to the panel here, because convening mechanisms have been very strong in putting public-private partnerships together, but it's very hard for private institutions to sit down and talk about their own social programs. And there probably does need to be a restructuring, I think, even of AID, if that's where some of the emphasis still lies, to try and maybe themselves use their convening mechanisms to start bringing companies together to work with each other. There's a tremendous lack of data. One of the main drivers of private-private type of partnerships is the leadership of the companies. Richard mentioned, I think, that there were some partnerships that between private companies that tend to spring out of the leaders meeting each other at conferences or at meetings, the Business Roundtable, International Chambers of Commerce. If leaders come from those meetings and are persuaded that they should be doing more partnership type of work, there's some good partnerships, I think, that could evolve, that have evolved. But the data that is needed to persuade the leadership of private companies that they should start to look more at working with other companies just doesn't really exist. It's not shared. And I think with technology, again, that Charles mentioned, there could be a much better data sharing that would help catalyze some better relationships, I think, between the companies that could work with each other. Why doesn't Caterpillar work with Coca-Cola, work with Chevron, work with in agricultural programs, in workforce development programs? I think there's a lot of duplication of effort where companies focus on a workforce development program that may be good for them, but if they shared it with some of the other companies in some of these conflict countries, I think you'd end up with much better scale and much better impact projects. There's competitive issues within companies, and it's not monopolistic issues. It's just probably issues around branding and communications around their social investment programs and their social investment drivers. And I think some companies tend to keep their projects sort of together by themselves because they want to go ahead and brand them. So some of the competitive issues need to be looked at very carefully. And then again, the last issue is corporate cultural differences. The difference between companies, the way their cultures are, between their business units, their head office, they're all issues that need to be addressed to try, I think, augment the way companies with each other. So again, I support enormously the power of partnership. I think we've all got super examples around that. I just wanted to throw out, as Charles did, around structural issues. There's a great opportunity right now over the next 3 to 4 years, I think also to start looking at how can the relationship between private companies be catalyzed to try and scale up and add sustainability to some of the existing private-public partnerships.
Thank you very much, Simon. And our final panelist is Bill Guyton, who, as I said earlier, has experience with the cocoa industry, pulling together the Global Cocoa Foundation, running it for 16 years. So, Bill?
Great, Greg, thank you for the introduction, and it's been a pleasure for me to hear from all of the panelists this morning and then during the panel discussion today. And I think all of us come from a different perspective, and I've learned a lot already just by hearing your points of view. So I wanted to thank you, and also to thank Dan Rundy and CSIS for allowing this platform or this discussion to take place. I think it's very timely. What I'd like to do over the next few minutes is just to talk about a case study in the cocoa industry and how corporations can collaborate together and how they can interact with different government agencies to help build stronger, more robust programs that really show impact over time. I had the opportunity to work with the foundation since it was formed back in 2000. And today it encompasses about 115 chocolate companies that represent about 85% of the world production of chocolate. The strategic interest of these companies is really in certain geographic areas. Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire produce collectively about over 60% of the global chocolate or cocoa produced in the world. Most of these are small-scale farmers. They live in remote areas. They're not part of farmer cooperatives or anything, so it makes it a real challenge, as you can imagine, for a large multinational to figure out how to work with this many small cocoa producers on the ground. About a third of the crop is lost from diseases and pests, and that was the catalyst for actually bringing the cocoa industry together to see how they could overcome some of the productivity problems. USAID was the convener of our industry at the beginning, and back in 2000, where we were trying to look at some of the economic, environmental, and social levers that were needed to help advance the cocoa and chocolate industry and help improve the lives of cocoa farmers. And over that period of time, it's been very interesting for me to see the evolution of how the partnerships have changed. I would say there was 3 major shocks that I saw during my 16 years with the Cocoa Foundation in West Africa that really helped to change their thinking. And I think the U.S. government, whether that be U.S. Department of Labor, USAID, State Department, or others, really helped us along that path. Back in 2000, there was an issue of child labor on cocoa farms, and it really kept, it caught the industry flat-footed. They didn't know about how to deal with child labor on cocoa farms. They didn't know exactly what the root causes were. And again, I think that's where the U.S. Department of Labor, USAID, and others were very helpful in being sort of the neutral source of trying to help the industry think through how to deal with that, how to engage with the African governments in dealing with it, and then ultimately helping to work with cocoa farmers at looking at alternatives to child labor. Another shock that happened during that time period was the 2008 conflict in Cote d'Ivoire, where a lot of the company members in the chocolate industry had operations on the ground. They had processing facilities. They had buildings up country. And during the conflict, their businesses were in danger, and they again turned to the U.S. government. At that point, it was National Security Council and U.S. State Department to look at solutions on how to deal with their businesses during that time period and to get better information of what was happening on the ground. And then the third kind of shock that happened was the Ebola outbreak. And again, I think it was a symbiotic relationship because our companies had operations on the ground. They had a platform that had already been developed thanks to USAID and the Gates Foundation and some of our other partners to really look at what types of activities, what kinds of interventions we could do on the ground to help address some of the problems of Ebola. So again, I think these partnerships are really critical, and I think there's opportunities now more than ever to leverage what's already existing on the ground, whether that through these private companies, to help leverage resources and to help where the U.S. government can really help the industry, I think, to catalyze what they're doing, to look at new innovations, to help educate the private sector investment on such things as child labor, and looking at how private sector interfaces with other governments. And I think that's another key where the U.S. government plays a really important role. So all I can say is really, I've seen that relationship change over time in the partnership. Right now, the chocolate industry is investing over $400 million in a new cocoa action strategy, is what they call it, where they're sharing data among each other, and they're sharing that data also with the U.S. government to look at how they can actually bring about impact on the ground, whether that be economic, social, or environmental. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bill and other panelists. We have a few minutes more and would open for a few questions, if there are any, or comments. Yes, sir. I believe there's a microphone somewhere in the room. Please come forward.
Many thanks. Thanks to all the panelists. My name is Paolo von Schirach. I'm the president of the Global Policy Institute here in Washington, D.C. Question to you, General. You said, if I understood correctly, that the U.S. military, this government in general, is structurally incapable of receiving or something like that, or at least challenged, severely challenged. Maybe that's a more appropriate way of putting it. Yes. But you were talking, if I'm not mistaken, in the present tense. Does it mean, just from my own understanding, that lessons of experience, starting with Afghanistan 2001, Iraq, you mentioned Iraq and the efforts and the challenges you found there. There's been more 15 years. Has anything been learned? In other words, is there an ability to adjust and to rethink practices, modalities, including, indeed, as your colleague Morgan said, talking about this creative partnership with the U.S. military in Africa. Is there any hope of absorbing lessons learned? And Iraq obviously offers, and Afghanistan even longer, an opportunity for reflection in terms of what works and what doesn't work, and models and best practices. My sense is that you are a bit pessimistic as to the ability to embrace and incorporate these experiences into new modalities. Is there hope, or you think it's still where?
Thank you, Paolo.
Thanks.
Let's take another couple of questions and then we'll deal with them.
Hi, this is really illuminating. Thanks, everyone. I'm Mindy Reiser. I'm a sociologist. I've worked in Central Asia and the Caucasus and Myanmar, South Africa, many places. Comment and question to you, Mr. Lowe's. How has Chevron managed its relationship with unions, incipient unions, unions in conflict with perhaps contractors, subcontractors? This is a delicate issue, and I realize it's not easy to intervene and work with governments that are sometimes antagonistic to all of this.
Now let's take one more question, way in the back there.
Hi there. Quick question for Morgan. I really like the idea you made of the hypothetical of embedding the investment perspectives into the military forces. Have you and your colleagues, when talking through this idea, how have you considered mitigating the risk of the PR scandal of looking like basically, Western colonialism coming in behind the military and taking advantage of the conditions you've set on the ground to further expand the treasure of the US? Thank you.
All right. So, General Cleveland, you want to take the first crack there?
Yeah, I think we have done a good job at the tactical level learning lessons, and our training centers, I think, do a good job now incorporating the human dimension to the battlefield that we put our tactical units. That's battalions and below, those that are on the ground. I think on the operational level, though, where you actually design your campaigns, the campaign's still going on, right? So I'm not sure we've learned yet just what the right lessons there. My own sense is we find it difficult to realize where the break point is between how I can use what I have better to achieve an effect, and at what point do I need something new and different in order to achieve a desired effect.
Simon?
The impediment normally is that we want to stick with what we've got versus create something new. I think that over time we're going to realize that we have to start creating new structures in the military, and I'm optimistic we'll get there.
Simon, would you like to address the issue with regard to unions?
I'm not sure I'm going to give you a really super answer on this, and I don't know, Heather, you might want to pop in here. Heather's the leader of our Niger Delta Partnership Initiative. Unions haven't, I just retired a couple of years ago, so again, I'm just speaking for myself at the moment, but during my career at Chevron, I didn't perceive in the area that we're talking about that unions were a major issue. Our concerns and our social challenges were mostly with just the communities around our areas of operation. We had union issues in most of our operating countries, but they were really just around operators that worked in tank farms or in refineries or and we're not a labor, Chevron was not a labor-intensive company, it's a capital-intensive company. So when there were union issues, they were mostly around labor practices, and our labor relations departments, I think, would negotiate with unions and hopefully would avoid strikes and come to satisfactory issues. But the unions didn't appear, unless I'm mistaken, to be a major issue in any of our stakeholder issues around community conflict. So around our community areas, we set up councils, and we turned over a lot of our community investment over to those councils so that we would avoid community conflict, because they were the ones that mostly were sort of creating all the issues around our platforms and our tank farms. And so we sort of learned a lot about dealing, I think, from a social standpoint with our communities. We never had many issues where the unions were creating conflict around our operating areas. Heather, have you had any, just real quickly? I think I haven't seen it happen.
In the interest of time,
Okay,
I think that's a good answer. Morgan?
Sure. So I love that third question. So I'll say a few things. One is when to me, the ideal investment in a post-conflict scenario involves local investment. So, whether that be private equity and high net worth individuals that are from that country, from that region, and are increasingly, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, foreign direct investment is in fact local direct investment in a lot of cases, and so those are some of the most successful. And it's in our interest as a government and as a nation to enable those investors to put capital into their own contexts. One, I think. Experience has shown that when capital investments go into post-conflict affected regions, short of total disasters and insensitivity, you see nothing but sort of an appreciation and a positive reaction from those in the market that is receiving it, because oftentimes what people are saying as they're recovering from war or conflict or mass conflict-driven IDP or migrant crises is what we need now most of all is capital. Put capital back into our economy so that we can revitalize our core markets, our core businesses, rebuild our infrastructure. So on that, I'd say there's also sectors that are appropriate and I think less appropriate in different stages of conflict. I think that while energy sectors in particular, oil and gas can be some of the most needed, but also can be some of the highest risk in terms of its ability to entrench power dynamics that only further conflict, as we've seen countless times. I think agribusiness is an example of one where it's slightly easier to get it right. Not easy by any stretch, but I say that because of a particular difference fundamentally in those sectors. One, the local community members are part of the supply chain much more so in sectors like agribusiness. They are also part of the consumers more often than in other sectors. So I think you see sectors that are more appropriate in recovering scenarios. So yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Morgan. And we have come to the end of the period allotted for our panel. I would like to conclude by observing, as Simon did, that 10 years ago, the idea of a corporation partnering with USAID was quite hard to understand and follow and implement. And today, Simon learned Civ Mill. And so we're making some progress. And we've heard examples of several partnerships that have worked. So it's not that this is a brand new thing. General Cleveland pointed out that the military is very disposed to entering into partnerships with the civilian sector, be it the government, civil society, or companies. But someone has to convene, someone has to lead. We've also seen that partnerships only work and last and produce long-term results when they are in the fundamental interest of those who participate, be they the military, be they the company, or be they the national security of the country. And I would point out that yesterday I heard the National Security Advisor General H.R. McMaster say on television that the strategy going forward is to combine, integrate the efforts of the military, the economic, and the diplomatic in the context of focused top priorities of the national security to be determined by the National Security Council and the President. So I think that all of us have the opportunity to lean into that, doing it in whether, if it applies to your own core business and your own primary mission, to lean into it and be a part of it, or at least to watch it and understand it, because eventually it could come into something that fits with your core interests. And in doing that, we can find a way forward, regardless of what the foreign assistance budget might be, and regardless of all the other regardlesses that are out there. So thank you, panel, and thank you, audience. Have a good day.
Case, particularly when we're dealing with the poorest of the poor and the most vulnerable of the most vulnerable on really big issues. So as I mentioned, we've got a great panel here, I think, for you. We're going to shift gears from fragile and failing states to rising middle income states. And as my colleague Dan Rundy sort of laid out in his really great paper, really I think developing countries can kind of be placed into those two different paths. And there's a different set of challenges facing those states than were faced in the panel previous, and in how companies and NGOs and governments are thinking about and working together on those issues. And in particular, I think that, as the general pointed out, we do have to sort of balance, particularly in the current electoral climate, the interests, what we perceive as our own selfish interests versus those of the globe. And I would like to make the argument that those interests often align in more ways than we think that they do. And in particular, with these rising middle income states, there is both a huge opportunity as well as a huge risk. And that opportunity lies in some of the obvious things, hopefully, like trade and investment and economic prosperity, hopefully rising all tides, all tides rising all boats as the whole global economy improves. I would also argue that there's a bigger risk if those states were to slip backwards. Oftentimes they become, once they become at that status, they become the linchpin in regional supply chains and other things, and if they were to fall backwards, that would pose a very big economic risk. And what I want to really talk about with our panel, because we've got really represented up here, not just people from their individual organizations, but all of them have had multiple roles across multiple parts of civil society, of government, and of the private sector. And I'm really privileged to be joined by my colleague Kathleen Stratman. Kathleen has a career across early childhood development. She's worked for 10 years on the Hill on these issues, and particularly around working with some of the most poor and vulnerable children here in the United States. She now leads the Global Alliance for Children, where they're working to help keep children in strong, nurturing families so that they become strong and nurtured adults. Help me to welcome Kathleen. If you could give her a hand, please. Next to Kathleen is Daniela Foster. Daniela has worked across both the public sector and the private sector. She was at the State Department, where she led many really innovative public-private partnerships, both engaging and empowering entrepreneurs, the tech sector, the mobile sector, and youth all around the globe. She's also held roles leading an innovation incubator at Mars, the delicious candy company, and now leading global corporate responsibility at Hilton Worldwide. Give Daniela a hand, please. Next to Daniela is Hugh Welsh. Hugh, I think, has one of the most amazing jobs. He's the president and general counsel for DSM. This is probably the largest company you've never heard of. DSM used to stand for Dutch State Mines, but they've really gone through an incredible transition over the last few decades from being that sort of traditional extractive company into being the company that is in a lot of the things you eat, a lot of things you use, and a lot of the things that really power your everyday life. So we're going to hear more from Hugh in a moment. Give Hugh a hand, please. And rounding out our panel, we have Kathy Pickus. Kathy started her career at the U.S. Information Agency, and then she went on to be Special Assistant for National Security Affairs for the Vice President, and then led Corporate Communications for Fruit of the Loom, and is now the Divisional Vice President for Sustainable Insights and Research at Abbott. Give Kathy a hand, please. So what I really like to do is kind of maybe pick up off of that last barrier about finding those non-traditional partners who can help us achieve our strategic objectives. And Kathy, you guys are leading healthcare company, one of the largest healthcare companies in the world. I'd love to know, where are you finding the shared value in these rising middle-income countries? And is it all in the health sector, or are you kind of going out from there?
Well, it's interesting. We're pulled in a lot of different directions, which is a very good thing, because we have, I think, incubated a lot of ideas in our foundation and taken them out of the foundation and put them squarely into our business. And we've demonstrated that if we are engaged on the right issues, and to the point about women's economic empowerment and human rights, you're just not picking these things out of the air, but you're doing things from a materiality perspective and really understanding where your stakeholders have expectations for you to deliver against. That drives your agenda. One of the first things that we did to really advance our programs in shared value came from a business challenge. It didn't come from us thinking about doing a philanthropic initiative in a specific market. It was about the head of our global supply chain coming to us from nutrition saying, look, I am operating in India, and in order for me to be effective, I need to source 80% of our inputs for our products from India. And I just dragged him down to Haiti about a year prior, and he saw in action when an organization would partner with an NGO that was really transforming an agricultural sector. And it was TechnoServe. TechnoServe is a brilliant NGO that is really looking at new solutions to disrupt agricultural processes and make them more efficient and a lot better. And also just making sure that they're purely market-based. And he said, do you think that TechnoServe could help us improve our business in India, help us acquire the quantity and quality of milk that we need for our products? And I said, absolutely. And luckily, we turned to the team in India and said, hey, can you help us understand and fix why we can't get enough high-quality milk with our partner in India to make sure that our manufacturing systems are strong. And within 1 year, there have been 1,500 individual farmers trained, 10 bulk milk chillers built, and the price is transparent to the farmers that are bringing us milk. The quality is up. The protein levels are up. There's no antibiotics detected in the supply, and this is transformational. And it's transformational on two fronts. It's for our business, because what we wanted to do is really invest in the market that we are selling in, but doing it in a meaningful way. The second thing is it's transformational and impactful for the women and the individual dairy farmers who previously were operating at a disadvantage. They didn't have the necessary training. They didn't have access to what the milk price was for that day, so they probably were not getting a fair price before this. And what we see now is a way for business to operate inclusively in a market in a way that helps both the business advance, build trust, but also to help society and help the people who are in our communities have a meaningful connection to the business so that they are very much part of our value chain.
So I want to unpack that a little bit. So what I heard you say there is, first of all, it didn't start with philanthropy. It didn't start with a social impact goal. It started with a business goal,
Right.
a business problem you were trying to solve. And then you went in and you found the opportunity to find a good partner in the person of TechnoServe who could help you solve that problem. Was there any government involved?
Well, government in terms of being fully briefed and fully supportive of us looking at local solutions to the problem. They didn't want us to import, and we basically delivered on that commitment to them.
Terrific. And then you were able to partner with TechnoServe to solve this business problem, transform the business, and transform that society that you were working inside
Absolutely.
of. How was it working with TechnoServe? Particularly, I'm interested, did they know or were they concerned about the fact that this was going to help your profit-making business?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I think TechnoServe, I think it was founded by former McKinsey guys who are like all about not, helping businesses in just a purely consultative way, but also helping people who are trying to work inclusively into our value chains. So they didn't have a problem with it. But we ran into the issue with some of the business leaders in India who thought that, look, our biggest contributions should be purely philanthropic. Not until they saw, 1 year into the program, the value that it had in society, did they come over to our side. And now they're saying, what else can we do? Now they're looking at our established pharmaceutical business and saying, hey, we've got products that are affordable, they're high quality, and they're needed by people who we currently can't reach. How can we tackle a shared value model to deliver that goal for society?
And last question.
And it's sustainable.
This is what years in India?
This is our first year.
First year. So does this count? I know in India, they have this
Yes.
law about having a certain contribution.
Yes, the 2% EARL.
Right. Does
Yeah.
it count?
Yes, aspects of it does. Mhm.
Awesome.
Which is good, and that's another conversation that we're having with the government as well, because I think if you have these general, legislative, directives that say you have to spend 2%, people will do things that might not necessarily be in the best interest of society, just to write a check. You've seen it before. You're handing out things and it disrupts and interrupts local small business owners. What we want to do is make sure that they are actually supported and bolstered.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kathy. Hugh, as I mentioned in my introduction of you, you run this really diversified business covering everything from materials to micronutrients and a lot in between. Where are you finding the shared value across all the different businesses and countries that you operate in? Maybe tell people a little bit about DSM, if you would.
Well, should I start with 115 years ago when we started digging coal out of the ground in the Limburg province of the Netherlands?
Maybe fast forward.
Okay. We started as a coal mining company 115 years ago, realized very quickly that coal mining wasn't our future. Sold the coal mines, and we're today in pretty much every business there is except for coal mining. One of the businesses we're in, it's very important to my great customer here, is nutrition. We're the world's largest nutritional ingredient company. And so we've taken that acronym, Dutch State Mines, and repurposed it to do something meaningful. And with being the world's largest nutritional ingredient company comes a great responsibility to share that knowledge, to share that material with folks who don't otherwise have it. And we look at the 2 billion people on the planet who suffer from what we refer to as hidden hunger, micronutrient deficiency, and try to find a way to alleviate that problem so everybody has an opportunity to reach their full potential. And our process, Richard, has been very evolutionary in that sense. In that we started on our own, I think, in the traditional way with forming a foundation, the Sight and Life Foundation, which would deliver vitamin A to different parts of the world to help mitigate childhood blindness. And that was relatively successful, impactful where we could reach, but not terribly scalable. And that evolutionary process continued through longstanding partnerships with the World Food Program. So we realized the World Food Program feeds tens of millions of children every day. They provide them with sufficient calories, but not sufficient micronutrients to reach their full potential. I think they had 4 nutritionists on staff from an employee population of 10,000. We have thousands of nutritional scientists on our staff. So we would second them to school feeding programs, and they would help get that sort of iconic red cup full of food, reaching the necessary micronutrient level. And that was great, but that was, again, only hitting a small part of the population. So we looked around to find a way where we could share all of this knowledge we have amongst our 25,000 employees with as many people as possible who needed it. And we got together with some of our other competitors, customers, collaborators, General Mills, Cargill, Hershey's, Arden Mills, Bueller, Not really the kind of companies you'd see coming together to work together for a common cause, but we came together to form another organization called Partners in Food Solutions. And essentially what that does is take the know-how from our respective employees and provide a facilitation mechanism so that they can work with smallholder farmers and food processors in Africa to transfer the knowledge we have here in the Western economies to other parts of the world that so desperately need the knowledge, but not always the money or the material. And that worked really well. But again, it wasn't scalable, it wasn't as impactful as we had hoped it to be. And we learned something, that there were no large-scale food processors in Africa to take some of the agricultural products grown by smallholder farmers to do fortification with nutritional ingredients. And so we looked around to try to find a way to mitigate that problem. And we said, well, you know what, why don't we just build our own organization? And so we started a new company called Africa Improved Foods. And this is where the non-traditional partners come to play, is that we looked all over the place for strategic partners. So, big multinational companies like DSM who might be interested in investing in a new entity that was going to build large-scale food manufacturing plants in Africa. And we couldn't find any. Nobody was willing to put capital at risk where there was a lot of uncertainty and maybe a lower return on investment, or as we would speak, lower return on capital employed than they might if they deployed that capital in places like Southeast Asia, China, Western Europe, or the United States. It was very, very frustrating for a company like ours who's looking to do something meaningful every day and create profits at the same time. So we went around to the NGO community to try to find folks who might be interested in investing in this for-profit enterprise, and the answer was no. Not so many folks were terribly interested in doing that. So we reached out to Chai, and they were great at helping facilitate the world between the one we operated in, the for-profit competitive world that we were in, and some of the aid agencies like CDC UK, FMO, IFC. And finally, we were able to come to terms after 2 years on a deal to form a new company called Africa Improved Foods with all of those other entities as shareholders in a for-profit enterprise. And we built our first facility in Kigali, Rwanda. Now, Kigali, Rwanda would not be the first place that we would pick as DSM to build a plant. It's just not a large addressable market. So if we looked at it with our traditional strategic business tools on how we deploy capital, it would not have made the cut. But what did make the cut was the fact that the government of Rwanda invited us in because they have a stunting issue there where 44% of the children in Rwanda are stunted. That's just unacceptable in a country that has the full capacity to grow all its own food. So at the invitation of the government of Rwanda, we came in and formed a subsidiary of Africa Improved Foods. I don't want to get too wonkish, but it's exciting for the M&A lawyer in me, called Africa Improved Foods Rwanda. And we made the government actually a shareholder. And the government's contribution wasn't cash. It was an in-kind contribution of some land on which to build the plant and some silos within which to store the maize and the soy. And the reason we wanted the government as a shareholder is we wanted the capacity to spin off some of our profits to the government to help underwrite an earmarked program to ensure that every child in Rwanda had access to this nutritious food that the plant was going to produce, no matter how poor. So the plant got started, up and running. We actually source our feedstock from smallholder farmers in the area. Currently, we're buying from 9,000 different smallholder farmers in Rwanda, maize and soy. We're producing a porridge, and that porridge is fortified, and it goes to children, say 1-year-old to 5-year-old, as well as expectant mothers. Our primary customer today is the World Food Program. And that is fantastic, because the World Food Program then has the capacity to source from an African producer rather than buying from Western Europe or the United States. And as some of you who've spent some time in Africa know, you see a lot of World Food Program food for sale on the market. You see a lot of USAID labeled food for sale on the market, and that has a stunting effect on the local economies. So you can imagine if we're able to source from local smallholder farmers, produce a product that meets World Food Program quality characteristics, that can then be distributed, and today they'll take everything we can make to send to Sudan, South Sudan, Somalia, et cetera. It creates a virtuous circle of economic development. Smallholder farmers who in the past were subsistence farmers now have the capacity to get contracts from our enterprise because they know they're going to be able to sell to us for years to come and borrow against those contracts. And they borrow against those contracts to get better seed, better fertilizer, mechanization, better infrastructure. We have the capacity to hire a lot of folks that work in Rwanda right now. We have 260 people working in our plant today, and I don't even have the grand opening until the end of this month. But the best part is it's completely replicable. So we can take this model and go anywhere in the world and build the same plant, making essentially the same food with hopefully additional shareholders going forward. Hopefully next week I'm going to have an announcement. We're going to sign a deal with the government of Ethiopia to build one in Addis as well. So I'll stop there. That's
Yeah, no, that's terrific. A couple of questions there. So one thing you said, so they're shareholders. I mean, they're actually
Correct.
owning shares in this venture. NGOs as well as governments?
Our current shareholders, in addition to DSM, are IFC, which you know is part of the World Bank,
Right.
CDC in the UK, and FMO in the Netherlands.
Wow.
And I can tell you they're not accustomed to being shareholders in a for-profit enterprise.
Right.
It was a surreal, almost Kafkaesque experience for me to negotiate this deal with them. I'm used to dealing with hedge funds and private equity. It was very, very different.
Yeah.
But I think they learned a lot from the experience as well.
So one of the issues that was brought up, well, two actually issues that were brought up in that little barrier session. One was about corruption, and the other was about choosing to focus on the business case for the poor and vulnerable. I mean, you guys did that here in Rwanda. I mean, that was not, as you said, it's not a big addressable market. It's not necessarily the best use of capital. How did you make that internal case, number one? And number two, particularly because you have government now as shareholders, and if you're thinking about replicating that model, are you concerned about corruption in the public space?
Yeah, I mean, corruption's always an issue, and I think that was part of the problem as to why it took so long for us to do this deal, because there are parts of the world who are accustomed to doing business a certain way now for many, many decades, and just simply don't accept yet that there's a new way to do business, so it takes some time to convince them. I don't know that my shareholders today are going to be my shareholders in all the different plants going forward. I hope this sets an example for the private sector, and then invite them to come in and be the shareholders of the future in the new facilities. And, you know, the business case for Rwanda is not as strong as the business case for Ethiopia. I think anybody who understands those two economies understands why. The business case for Africa is enormous. So in boardrooms all over the world, all of us big, you know, Western multinational publicly traded companies are having a conversation of where does our future growth come from? It's not coming from Western Europe. It's not coming from the United States. Even in China, it's going to be a struggle. It's going to come from places like Africa, like Southeast Asia, like Latin America. And these are a means by which for us to learn about doing business in these countries and growing our business in these countries. We don't want to be in the business of producing food going forward. DSM is not a food producer company. We're an ingredients company. We'll have this Africa Improved Foods enterprise ultimately go public on some market in Africa or be sold ultimately, maybe even to management. But once we get these things established, we're actually building markets for ourselves going forward.
So it's a long-term strategic bet.
Absolutely.
Great. Daniela, I was really surprised. When we were talking before, you told me that 1 in 10 jobs are created in the travel and tourism space. You guys have a tremendous challenge and a tremendous opportunity when it comes to the youth skills gap. I know my first job was in the hospitality space, so I know it's a big entry point for a lot of folks around the world. What are you guys doing, and where are you creating the shared value?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I want to get back to this issue of materiality a bit, because I think that that's really key to understand when you're looking to develop partnerships across business. So one of the great things about Hilton is we do have a comprehensive, holistic approach to how we look at where we invest and the innovative solutions and partners that we work with. One of the key issues under our corporate responsibility umbrella, which we call Travel with Purpose, is youth, and in particular, creating opportunities for youth. It's a very interesting space for a number of reasons. If you look at the global youth unemployment crisis, it is one of the worst unemployment crises that we've seen in modern history. So we have 71 million young people unemployed. If you just look at the labor force that's either unemployed or working yet living in poverty, it's 43%. So these are really, really big global issues. It's also, for Hilton, a key material issue. So when you look across the business, we right now employ, I would say, about over 40% of our workforce is millennial. In the next 5 years, it will be 70%. If you think about that global youth unemployment crisis that I just mentioned, and you think about the amount of hires you're going to have within travel and tourism, you'll have about 85 million new jobs in the next decade or so if the industry committed to
just half of those jobs going to young people. We could cut the global youth unemployment crisis in half. So I think that this is a tremendous opportunity, tremendous challenge, but an opportunity that has to be done in partnership. So we as Hilton we pledged to connect, prepare, or employ 1 million young people by 2019. It's kept us very busy. We're about to come up on the 2019 mark pretty soon. I feel like the days go faster every day. But we have hit our midway point to that goal, and I can tell you, to get there, we've had to do that in partnership. So there are a number of different things we do. We partner with International Youth Foundation. One of the core elements of our Connect, Prepare, and Employ is to prepare. So how do you close the youth skills gap? If you ask employers what some of the challenges they have around hiring are, it really is some of what I like to call power skills. Some people will call them soft skills, but I'm going to call them power skills. It's those skills, those sort of workforce readiness pieces around how you communicate and collaborate with a team, how you think creatively, how you problem solve, how adaptable are you in a world where disruption is the constant norm and where you're dealing with people, where you have to adapt. So we partner with International Youth Foundation around the world to deliver Passport to Success. It is a proven power skills training program. We are working in many cases in partnerships with local governments, with NGOs. We are even working across sector as we look at how do you ultimately provide young people with skills that are transferable. So while we need to hire a lot of people, and we have a tremendous amount of opportunities across the breadth of what Hilton does, we actually hire a lot of analysts and sort of non-traditional roles that you would think about. It is critical that young people have those foundational, fundamental skills. So we've been doing a lot around that. The other piece that we do quite a bit around is we're working on sort of research in this space. So we will launch this summer the second version of the Global Youth Wellbeing Index, and that looks across 30 countries and really hones in on what are the well-being issues of interest to millennials today. And I think one of the interesting pieces about this is this go around. We will be offering it open source, so it will be free and open source for everyone to kind of take it, parse out the data as they will. It's also interesting because we've incorporated actual millennial person data into the survey, so it's sort of data for youth by youth, and it's interesting because some of the factual data that we know doesn't match up with the perception data, right? And I think those perception pieces are really important. So we're looking at this holistically, everything from, how do you create systemic change? How do you transform systems so you do have a little bit better sort of demand signaling between education systems and the actual business needs of the employers who will be hiring? How do you set up young people for success? I think that is one of the most critical issues that we are going to be facing in the future, even as we think about the Sustainable Development Goals and what young people are going to inherit, which is the planet and the world. And so what's their piece in this? I think all of these are incredibly important. During our lunch conversation today, we were talking about sort of the kinetic energy of youth. And what we do know is young people are very jazzed up and dynamic, and how do we make sure that we tap into them as agents of change, and that they are really connected with the right with the right opportunities, whether it's the opportunity for their first job and entering the workforce, or that they feel connected to civil society, that they feel their government hears them. A number of different things that are really sort of underlying some of the larger global issues and challenges we're facing. So all of that is just to say that this is a really big issue, and we are thinking about it holistically. It's a core business issue for us, but I would argue it's also a very core societal issue, and it's not the kind of thing that can be tackled by one industry, sector, entity, on our own. It really has to be done in partnership.
Yeah, as I mentioned, my very first job was in the hospitality sector. I was a janitor's assistant at a golf course. If you think about what
Nice.
a janitor does, a janitor picks up
Nice.
stuff you don't want to pick
Yeah.
up, the assistant picks up stuff the janitor doesn't want to pick up. So it taught me a lot about consulting, for those of you who are thinking about consulting. But Daniela, so you said, I mean, you're working with NGOs and you're working with civil society and the governments. Why? Why do you need to partner with them on these programs? Why can't Hilton do it all alone?
It's kind of like what I was just talking about. One sidebar on that I think is really interesting, because you mentioned the janitor piece. What I think a lot of people don't realize about hospitality is the growth potential. So, for example, our CEO actually started out plunging toilets, and he's now the CEO of Hilton. And that's not an uncommon story across our business. There are a number of stories of folks who've started out in various places and then kind of moved on from there. But I say that because it's genuinely a passion point for our leaders and for the business. In terms of partnering, this is not something you can tackle alone. When you think about the global youth unemployment crisis, and there have been a number of conversations about where things start, where do you intervene and start to think about the impact you're having, I think it's a holistic 360 impact. It's everything from, as a young person, when you're, going up and going through school or sort of in your community, how do you know what you want to do and what you want to be when you grow up? If you've never had the opportunity to leave your community or to experience or get exposure to any types of careers. So that is one reason why I think there has to be a tremendous amount of partnership across sectors. So everything from looking at education to thinking about the local government side of things. We're increasingly working a lot with mayors' offices as you look at even just summer jobs. It's almost rethinking a lot of your systems too. It's providing initial exposure on through to skills training, on through to how do you rethink and revitalize education systems. How do you work with governments as they're thinking about legislation, and then how does that feed up to the global sustainable development goals? I really see it as an ecosystem, and at the end of the day, to create that really big collective impact, you have to do it in partnership, and you have to do it at the systemic level.
So it's because you are trying to operate at that level, at that systemic level, to create those ecosystems and really change things at a societal level.
And it's a process, right?
Awesome. Thank you, Daniela. Kathleen, you guys, you've really formed through the Global Alliance. You're I think, the only non-company up here, but you've created this.
The other side of the partner.
That's right. You've created a really fascinating collective impact model there. Tell people a little bit about what the Global Alliance is up to and how you've built a collective impact model that allows different partners to come in at the level that's appropriate for them.
Sure. So, in order to explain why we felt an opportunity was needed to form public-private partnership, I just want to spend a minute talking about the hugest opportunity, which I think is our mission. The reason the Global Alliance was formed 3 years ago is just the basic recognition, and you're seeing a lot of this come out now more recently in the World Bank conversations, is that we know that about 250 million children in the world are not meeting their developmental potential, and that's got a huge consequence for the entire globe when we look at an economy that's going to be based on the development of the human brain. We're no longer going to be in a situation where industrial and agricultural and all these other things that are right now the basis of so many of our economies are going to be the basis of those economies moving forward. And this has real consequences, obviously, for those of us here in the United States, but even more so in the developing world. And so one of the things that we knew is that this was happening for two main reasons. One is that in the case of about 10 million children, they are completely outside of the nurturing relationship that's necessary for the human brain to grow. So they're either living in institutions, they're living on the street, they're children on the move. And then another untold number of millions more are in situations where they're in families, but their families are not strong enough to be able to provide that nurturing environment, or that overall family is stressed by conflict, disaster, and other things. And so it became really important to many of our partners, especially since the brain science is just so compelling and so clear, I remember the first time I saw it, that, in the first 2 years of life, 700 neurons of the child's brain are formed every minute. So this is just a really critical window that if we can get in and help support families and show them how important their relationship with their child is, that we can make a great impact. And so what we like to say at the Alliance is that strong and nurturing families produce thriving children, and it's producing those thriving children that will produce a secure future for their country. So I wanted to just start, that's why we're so focused. All of our members, we range anywhere from Usaid as a principal founder to Lumos Foundation, which is J.K. Rowling, the author of most of the Harry Potter books, who's very focused on deinstitutionalization. We have our job is to kind of create the platforms through which partners with interest can come together. And we have one that is now about 2 years old, and we are now launching a second platform. I wanted to tell you a little bit about the first one. The first platform is called Family Care First. It's focused on supporting the Cambodian government in its own goal of increasing the number of children that are in safe, nurturing, and family-based care. They recognize it's a critical part of their own growth. Some of the opportunities that we saw almost immediately, one thing we heard was that a lot of times, particularly the corporate sector and private foundations are approached just for their money, just as investors in the strictest sense of that word. And what we have found is there's at least 3 other ways that we can engage partners. First is that most private sector individuals and corporations understand systems at a level that social service focused people, as well as civil society, often don't. And I love to tell the story about when I was first doing this work. I had a friend who was the CEO of Vought Aircrafts, and I invited him to come to a child welfare presentation. And he left after 2 hours and said to me, after 2 hours of listening, and said to me, I have no idea why there are so many kids that are in foster care in Tennessee, but I know that I'm going to give you my 6 best systems people because I think they can solve it in about a year. Because all I saw was system challenges that are just not being met. And true to his word, he did give 6 of his best people who spent 2 years working with the state of Tennessee to fix those problems. The second example, I think, are things like data for good. So many corporations are doing early work in developing countries. They understand human behavior. They're doing a lot of social research. That's information that they collect at first in order to test whether it's a good market. This is incredibly important information for those who are looking at those same habits in order to try and change social behavior. And it's often something that the corporations are very willing to share if asked. And it can be anything from, the walking patterns that are used for Starbucks to determine whether they're going to put a store can help you know who's going to certain areas for healthcare or other things. The third thing we found is that oftentimes it's corporate partners that have already been able to develop networks beyond maybe what the governments themselves are able to tap into. This has been very much true in Cambodia. Facebook is very, very popular there. Oftentimes it's a main source of communication for the government to the people that they're trying to serve. I think a great example I saw recently of this very phenomena was that I was in Canada last week, and Starbucks had just hosted an amazing science challenge for 10 to 14-year-olds in Canada to talk about how they might improve a specific thing on the global in the global scale. And 2 12-year-olds had developed a clean water technology that'll likely improve the future of clean water. And it was just because people at Starbucks customers opened up a whole new opportunity to engage in some innovation and some thinking. And I could see a lot of opportunities in those ways. The final thing that we've done is also to just really bring together and try and break down the silos that exist in various sectors. So we are looking at this from a healthcare, education, and a child protection lens. We're not looking at it solely from any one of those. And a really good example is where we use data to show how, if you look at the number of children that are in institutional care in Cambodia, we did a lot of just basic consumer information research to understand why parents were choosing to put their children in institutions. And we learned that for a considerable number of them, it was because the schools that were provided by the residential care centers, often funded and run by foreigners, were actually better schools than were in the local communities. Why were they better? They were full-day schools as opposed to being half-day, which is what the government of Cambodia can afford for public education. They would include curriculum such as English, science, and math, which were not as robust in the local schools. So unwittingly, what we had done is we'd created the International School for the Orphan, is what we kind of joked. And so if we hadn't brought the education sectors together with those who were working to get those children out of the institutions, you quite literally could have had one sector investing in one thing and the other sector investing in the opposite, and neither of them actually achieving their goals. I guess the other thing that I just wanted to hint on is we've just now started to try and build a second platform, because what we've found is true in Cambodia and is true globally and is incredibly important now that we're looking at the Sustainable Development Goals, is that right now, the main mechanism that we help most countries identify data gaps is through household-based surveys. So right now, all of the Sustainable Development Goals and all of the related indicators will be used, will be tested and measured through household-based surveys. So by definition, children that are outside households, some of the most vulnerable children in the world, are not a part of that equation. So children that live in institutions, children that live on the streets, by design right now are being ignored. And I see this as a huge opportunity because, we're not talking about missing children. In many cases, we know exactly where they are, but we're talking about having the skills and the innovation challenges and other things that we've seen break through some of the other challenges in global development and put it to good use in this case. So we're working on that.
So a couple things I heard you say there. First of all, that this was one of the primary goals of the Cambodian government itself. So you're really helping that government achieve its own objectives. And you're building platforms so that it can think systemically and across society, similar to the way Daniela was talking about, and that you have the capability of taking different types of contributions, whether they're skills or technology or products, and as well as cash, to help try to tackle these problems in a systemic way.
Absolutely. I mean, I think my husband's an investment banker, and sometimes I come home and say our jobs are very similar. He's structuring deals, and I'm brokering deals in the very same way. I will have the community partners identify a place where they don't have the capacity in country or they don't have the partners, and then the job of the alliance is to try and find that partner and bring it to scale.
Daniela, Hugh, Kathy, I mean, what do you think about what Kathleen is laying out there in terms of that approach, and how do we create programs, or how can we help Kathleen achieve her objectives, but also how do we create programs that perhaps are similar or better?
It's great. I love the part that she was talking about in terms of the strength of partnerships, because clearly none of us can do it alone. And, we've heard that for a number of years. But I think the proof now is in the day that it's coming out. I mean, from our perspective, we would look to an organization like yours because you have the reach, the know-how that we don't. I mean, you're operating in places where we probably just don't have the manpower, but we can supplement it with the expertise, the processes, and the procedures. And, I think that there's a science and also an art to this whole endeavor. And that's coming together to make sure that you're bringing together as many of the different partners across the spectrum to be as effective and coordinated as possible. If I step back and think about that, one of the biggest achievements that's taken place in the last 10 years has been the breakdown of silos. And we need to, now we're not there fully, there's more to be done, but the coordination and the collaboration across different partnerships to really drive scale is significant.
Hugh?
Yeah, I mean, to be a little provocative, when I look across the portfolio of businesses we have in DSM, there's no square fit, right, with what Kathleen's doing. There's no business case for us to deploy capital in this way or human capital, but I do think there's opportunities. And I like the part of the story you told where you borrowed some systems experts to come in and help in Tennessee debottleneck or make the system more efficient. And there, I think there's a lot of opportunities to work with the private sector if those things are pitched as, hey, I can create experiential learning opportunities for your talent, and your millennial talent all wants to work in a purpose-driven manner. why don't you second a couple of folks for me, even if it's, part-time, and we could help you achieve your aim, even though your mission is not necessarily aligned with our mission.
So I want to delve a little bit deeper on that. In particular, we've heard now all of your different stories about public-private partnerships and bringing strange bedfellows to the table. And I'd like to get into some of the hows of that and really thinking about how do we bring these people to the table and how do we keep them at the table. Hugh, you made the case just there about kind of pitching it in that way to help with an employee engagement issue. Daniela, what is your experience with, what are the kinds of opportunities that when you hear them, you're like, yep, that's for Hilton?
It's interesting because I was just thinking about what you were saying, Kathleen, and I think one of the most important takeaways here is that when you're thinking about public-private partnerships and how you structure these collaborations is to think about it in sort of an untraditional way. So, the old school model of sort of donor recipient and coming to companies for purely funds and resources, I think those days are gone. It's really all about creatively what can you work on together. And I really get most excited when I see, a problem that is a really big issue, that's something that's material for Hilton or that we touch. So, we're in over 100 countries. We have nearly 5,000 properties around the world, 360 team members. So if something has the potential to scale, have truly local impact, but then also scale either regionally or globally, I think that's powerful. And then also if something is a new, different, innovative solution. Even just talking about data for good, we've done a lot around measurement, a ton, especially around, how we measure the impact we're having in the communities that we work on. So we have a program called Lightstay. We've made it a brand standard, and it's enabled us to sort of pinpoint the environmental impact as well as the social impact. And it also enables us to infuse within the communities we're working with, but also with our partners and team members, a bit of accountability, and also helps us to get smarter in terms of where we partner and the issues we tackle. So I think data is important. I think different innovative solutions are really important, and then I think coming at it from a bit of an untraditional way in terms of saying, what is this company, organization, entity really good at, and how can they bring that to the table, and not just talking about it in terms of a monetary.
So if I want to with Hilton, I should do my research, figure out where I can have material impact on a strategic objective of yours. I need to be able to explain how I'm going to scale it, why it's new and different, and I need to have the data and evidence to back it up.
And I can tell you what the issues are. It's creating opportunities. It's sort of what we talked about around youth unemployment and then bridging the skills gap. It's preserving the environment. So for us, looking at circular economy pieces, so water, waste, carbon, responsible sourcing, and then it's building resilient communities. So that's the work we do around volunteerism, human rights, creating entrepreneurs within the business, et cetera.
Excellent. Kathy?
No, I just wanted to respond to your question about what keeps people at the table.
Yeah, please.
You know that the idea is spot on and in the best interest of all parties. They're still at the table 5 years, 10 years down the road, because you know that it's market-based, it's something that is driving value for everyone. And that's the test of time.
Mm-hmm. I want to delve into that point and something that Daniela made. One is, how do you keep people at the table if you have to pivot? So you thought you were going to go down this way. Now you say, well, it didn't work. I'm going to try it. One of the things I've noticed in the civil sector is that the price of failure is a lot higher in some ways than it is in the private sector, because in the private sector, failure is part of learning and it's accepted. And there's many, many entrepreneurial stories of guys who went on to be billionaires after blowing up 3 or 4 businesses. Not so much so in the civil sector. You tend to lose your donor trust if you do that. So I'm interested in how do we deal with that issue. And then Daniela raised the issue of measurement, and I want to talk about how do we measure collective impact. So who wants to jump on either of those grenades? Hugh? Pivots.
I would think the civil sector wants to enter into these things for the same reason the private sector does, in that we're hedging respective risk. Mm-hmm. So I'm not going to deploy $45 million of capital to build a plant in Rwanda myself, right? The risk is too high for me to do that. So I need to find a way to offset some of that investment and hedge that risk. The same for the civil sector, right? There are certain opportunities that they want to realize that they're not going to be able to unless they attract private capital. And so there is a risk hedging mechanism for them as well. I don't know that they see the world that way yet, but I think in the new, more nationalistic, isolationistic, budget-constrained world, we're going to see more of that. And it's going to be a very interesting few years, not just here in the United States, but in other parts of the world as well.
So partnership is a risk mitigation strategy?
Correct.
Both sides. Measurement or pivots? Daniela, Kathy, go ahead, Dan.
So I think with pivots, I mean, one of the most important things with partnership, and just putting my former State Department hat on, is transparency among partners. So I think if you're really transparent with, like, look, this is the issue we want to tackle, this is the piece of it we think is our core competency or what we bring to the table, these are the risks we're both looking to sort of hedge and mitigate, and these are some of the risks and challenges. I think with a really good partnership where you've done your due diligence and you have a clear understanding of what you're tackling, ideally there will be some pivots, because you will either learn new information or have developed a model that may be different than what you initially thought it would be. But I think the trust, the transparency, and the ongoing sort of communication and trying to be clear about what you're finding and what your challenges are an important part of that.
Go ahead, Kathy.
I was going to say pretty much what Daniela said, is that there are rarely, any partnerships that looks exactly the same day one as in day, 2000. I mean, I think that it's an evolution, and we come in with a mutually agreed upon goal, and there are bends and turns, but you stick with it, and you adjust and adapt to challenges and opportunities, and hopefully you're better at the end.
Awesome. So I want to come to you guys in the audience, but I want to do that in a slightly different way. So first of all, same pattern that we did at the beginning. I want you to turn to the person behind you. You've heard a lot of different ideas, a lot of different approaches to collective impact and to multi-sector partnerships. Turn to the person behind you. Share the number one thing that you learned today that you think you could apply to your multi-sector partnership or work. You got 1 minute. Think to yourself. Think to yourself first. Think before you speak, extroverts, unlike me. Those of you who are introverted, this is for you. Take a second and then turn around and share. One minute, folks, 1 minute, and then you're going to share. 1 minute. Okay, guys, can we come back? Shh. Let's come back together. I'd love to hear a few ideas and a few questions. And the idea here is I'd like some of your ideas about how you might apply these things, and we'll get live feedback from our experts up here, so hopefully you walk away with a few things you can actually go and do. So who's got an idea, something that they took away from today that they want to share, or an idea how they might apply it? There you go, in the back, sir. If you could tell us your name, please.
If you don't mind standing.
Not at all. I'm happy to stand. Andrew Mack is my name. So two things that we took away we were just talking about, and they got mentioned over lunch as well. We have a tendency to look at partnerships as being between organizations. And it's all fine and good, but the truth of the matter is that organizations don't sign contracts. People sign contracts. And one of the biggest, when we're talking about data and the ability to drive data, it's not for the general public. The general public is interested, but only this much, right? It's really for internal audiences and near proximity audiences. So one of the things that seems to be a very big missing piece of this is developing the language and the capacity to get people recognition for the partnership work that they're doing, for the risks that they're taking. I'll reference one partnership we worked on a number of years ago between Chevron and a number of other private sector partners, as well as 3 parts of the Nigerian government, 2 parts of the World Bank. We knew that it was a road safety partnership in Nigeria, and we knew that that was going to be successful when the person from the World Bank got promoted, the person from Chevron got promoted, and the person who was running the Federal Road Safety Commission is now a minister in the government, right? So 12 years on, we've been out of it for 6 years, it's still, going gangbusters, in part because everybody saw something in it for them, not just as organizations, but as individuals. One other little quick thing, which is I've heard no mention of diaspora. And I think that might be something to include into the conversation. Thank you.
Excellent. We'll come back to that. So partnerships are with people, and we need to make sure that we can tell stories and develop the language that allow people to get recognized, and for partnership work to help them advance in their careers. Thank you. Who's got another idea? I want to get at least 3, and then we'll get some reactions from our panelists. So who's got another one? Oh, right there. Tell us who you are, please.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Proctor. I'm from APICS, which is a supply chain organization. And one thing that we struggle with at APICS, and I'm seeing this on the panelists too, is we all have different languages for the same thing. We talk about value chain at APICS, and we talk about driving, the business case, but everyone up there has the same thing. It's just we need to kind of break the way we're talking about it and think about the way that the other person or other partner is going to talk about it. And that's, I guess, one of my questions to you is how do we do that? How do we kind of get outside of our own semantics?
Yeah. Winston Churchill said America and the United Kingdom are 2 great countries separated by a common language. And I often find that to be very true here in this. And in fact, Kathleen and I were just talking about that while you guys were all chatting about the differences in language. Thank you, Jen. Who's got another thought, another idea? I got all day. Oh, there you go.
Hi, I'm Chantal Akinyemi. I'm a student at Johns Hopkins. And we were talking about the DSM case in Rwanda. And as a student, you kind of hear all of these things about how you have to, prove the market case, and you have to make sure that it makes business sense. And that's a case where that wasn't necessarily true, but you did it anyway because you had such strong partnerships with the government, and then you were able to replicate that everywhere else. So I thought that was something that was really interesting and something that I can hopefully take forward.
Thanks very much. Oh, right in the back, we'll get that last one, and then I want to get some reactions from the panel.
Hi there, my name's Sam. I'm a co-founder of an Australian company that helps veterans transition to the civilian workplace. And a large part of what we do is helping educate the private sector on why veterans are valuable to the workplace. One of the big things that we found as we were learning the human resources sector, and that's across all industries general, was that it was broken because the majority of the people were just executing the systems in place as opposed to actually thinking. There were obvious solutions to problems that when someone had been studying the sector for 6 months, career professionals we'd never thought of that. So I think a huge part of this, although systems and stuff need to be put in place, leadership is so important to encourage people to break out of the systems that are already in place, encouraging people to think outside the box, rewarding people to think outside the box. I think it makes a huge difference.
Beautiful. So how do we think within systems, but also how do we think differently about those systems and bring fresh eyes to those problems? So panelists, we heard there, partnerships are with people. We need to get a language and a way of getting people recognized for the good work that they're doing as partners. Bring the diaspora question in, the different language barriers that are out there, and how do we think systemically but differently? What are your thoughts about those things? Hugh, you got.
So how do you get people recognition for their participation in partnerships? I can speak from the DSM perspective, where we're very much not about rhetoric, we're all about remuneration. So if you go read our annual report, which just came out last week, we're going to have our annual results tomorrow, you'll see that all of the executives in our company, half of our bonuses, both our near term, so our annual cash bonuses, and our long term, our stock options, are tied to sustainability goals. And those sustainability goals are tied to partnerships. And so all of the 375 executives that work in the company, in one way, shape, or form, are working on these types of public-private partnerships, or whatever vernacular you choose to use, every day. And their success in that field is tied directly back to their annual remuneration. It might sound petty, but you follow the money, and that's where change comes.
Well, I also heard that the young lady here, Chantal, was that? She said that it's not just about she was taking away. You don't necessarily need a business case. I don't think that's what you meant, though. It's not no business case. It's a different, more material business case.
It wasn't the best business case, but there certainly was a business case, Chantal. So if there were no business case for us to build this facility in Rwanda, it would be irresponsible to do so. It might sound harsh, because there's a 44% stunting issue in Rwanda, but it would be irresponsible because it would not be a sustainable operation. And as a consequence, all of the smallholder farmers who borrowed against contracts we wrote that we wouldn't be able to honor would go under. All of the children that became dependent upon the food that we were producing would go without. All of the folks who became dependent upon the jobs we created would lose those jobs. So there has to be a business case in order for the operation to be sustainable, because if it's not sustainable, it's not responsible.
But the business case isn't necessarily always just dollars and cents, and it's not just, there are other factors that come into play. Is that fair? No?
Yes, that's fair.
Daniela?
Yeah, I think one of the most important pieces of this is two things. One, you need leadership support. You absolutely have to have leadership support. And whether it's a business case or making the case for how it's something that your organization, company, et cetera, can uniquely do an impact, I think that's critical. I think, for Hilton, one of the best things that I've noticed is our CEO is heavily committed to what we're doing through our Travel with Purpose program. He's heavily committed to the youth unemployment issue, and he's been a passionate advocate for it. So I think that's critical, making sure your senior leadership is on board. The other thing that I think is critical, and I want to get back to the point around communication. Communication is absolutely critical. I cannot stress this enough, particularly for the areas in which we work. We're all looking at very complex problems, very intricate nuances and different elements of them, maybe even complex partnerships, and being able to distill it down to the key issues and the key impact that you can have, and being able to communicate that to different audiences is critical. How you communicate it to your senior leadership versus team member, a team member base of 360,000 is going to look a little bit different versus how you may do something that's a bit consumer facing. I think all of those are going to look different, and they should, because you should be tailoring the most important points to your audience. I think the communication aspect is critical for partners and partnerships, and I think it's typically a big gap. I mean, we're used to talking to each other. We all have different acronyms. We all have different lingo. How we distill it down and how we storytell, both digitally and visually, is critical.
So we need to be prepared to communicate to different audiences, speak in their language, develop really compelling stories that people can share with each other within those communities, and be aware of the differences, though, within those different communities. And demonstrate impact using data and evidence. Excellent. And stories. Yep, that's awesome. Kathy?
It goes back to the question or your statement about driving change in an organization. My company is 130 years old. And, not always when we come in with these really great new, brand new, never been tried before ideas is everybody on board. But one of the things that we have is that we have a sustainability council. And some of the best ideas come from people who are at the local level, who are dealing with various issues, who are willing to say and join us in this conversation about there's got to be a better way. And we as businesses, whether we're 6 months old or 600, we have to be open to being new in our thinking, because the competitive landscape is constantly changing, and the world that we're competing in now is completely different from what it's been in the past. It's going to require us to think differently, act differently, take on more risk, and have those innovative partnerships that we've never had before.
So disruption is the new normal. We need to be thinking about how we're going to deal with all of those problems on a constant basis, and be prepared to break our models if we have to. Yep. Kathleen?
I was just going to pick up on, again, some of the comments in the back, because what I think, and actually some of the comments that were at the very beginning, I mean, there's two challenges. One is, I think, one thing that is the reality in the private sector is, like you said, innovation is a daily part of your thinking, because you have to stay ahead of your competitors. And that is not necessarily true. As you were saying, there are some systems that have been acknowledged broken for centuries, and there isn't that same, ethos that says, okay, and so inviting those who kind of have it as part of their daily makeup to be thinking about how to solve problems into a place where that isn't happening as often as it can. And sometimes I think, like anything, these are systems themselves. If you look at just even the recent example of the Give Directly, it's a hard thing to say that now through technology we could do microfinance directly to people, but it's now a technological reality. Now, let's be honest, that might eliminate a huge competitive middle that isn't going to like that so much at first, but that type of disruption, that type of honest conversation might ultimately emerge into a place where more people are able to be helped at the outset. But those conversations happen every day in the business world. They just do, and they don't necessarily always happen in social service. I think the question, though, that I struggle with every day is that I cannot always make the economic case about some of the world's biggest challenge. And there may not always be the opportunity to show someone a tangible bottom line. And how do we continue to create opportunities, incentives, understanding that their reality is not one that can, as you said, you can't go there unless you can make sure you get out to the other side.
So what I hear you saying is that for those of us who are in the civil and public sector, the creative destruction that has defined the private sector is coming to us, exactly. And we better get ready for that and be ready to deal with it. And
be happy for it.
And be happy for it, because it's going to help us change the way we do things. But we also need to be cognizant of the fact that that's not always going to necessarily be comfortable for us. Yep. Yeah, excellent. So last question, because we're running out of time. When I asked everybody to stand up at the very beginning, what we revealed was that most of the folks here are seasoned practitioners. I would love to know from each of you, the number one thing for those of us who are steeped in this field, what's the number one thing that they can go away and do, in your opinion, to improve the ability of their collaboration to move forward? And Kathleen, I'll start with you.
Well, I guess, another age-old business principle is go where no one's gone before. So, I mean, one thing that I find is that it's always safer when you feel like there's already a lot of public-private partnership going on in a particular social space. It's never easy to be the one who sets the norm. So, I guess, look for that space where you could be the leader, and I promise others would follow.
Excellent. Daniela?
So putting on my past public-private partnership hat, I would say the number one thing that has worked across, whether it's been working in government or business, is to start small but think big. If you can come in with a pilot and a partner and demonstrate you're going to start something, you're going to pilot it, you're going to test it out, and you frame it in that way, and you're going to get some data and research and determine if it makes sense to move it forward and scale it, you will most likely be able to get it through. So start small, but think big.
Excellent. Hugh?
It'll be from my own experience, my own failings. It's to learn how to listen to what the non-traditional partner, the NGO, the civil organization is saying, even when they're not saying it in the language that you understand, to internalize what value means to them and be able to incorporate that into the model that you're creating, rather than just automatically in a knee-jerk way explaining what you need and how you need it and why it's important to you. That capacity to listen, I think, is fundamental for any of these types of partnerships to work.
Excellent. Kathy, last word.
When you're going into spaces where no one's been before, it can be a challenging place. Don't give up. A lot of these achievements come with scrapes and bruises, but, stay the course.
So go where no one's gone before, start small, think big, learn to listen to your strange bedfellows, but don't give up. Excellent. Ladies and gentlemen, help me thank Kathleen Stratman, Daniela Foster, Hugh Welsh, and Kathy Pickus.